Hello, everybody. My name is Tanya Costa, and it is my pleasure to welcome you to today's webinar entitled Landscape and Overview 101. This is part one of a three-part series called Landscape and Emerging Issues with E-Cigarettes. A few housekeeping notes before we get to today's presentation. Everybody is muted on today's webinar. In the chat box, participants can type in any questions or comments during the presentation, and we will reserve some time at the end for a Q&A period. If we do not get to your questions, feel free to send them via email, and we will ensure that they are answered. We will be recording and archiving today's webinar for future viewing. The link will be sent out along with today's evaluation survey. A full bio for our guest speakers, a resource sheet, and the evaluation link will be sent out post-webinar. Now let me introduce you to Cindy Baker-Burrell, Program Manager at Simcoe Muskoka Health Unit for the Smoke-Free Program, which includes the Central East Tobacco Control Network. Cindy will introduce today's webinar and our special guest speakers. Cindy, I'll turn it over to you to do the land acknowledgements.
We recognize that our work and the work of our members takes place on traditional Indigenous territories across Ontario. We also wish to acknowledge that the office of the RNAO is located on the traditional Indigenous territory of the Huron-Wendat, Haudenosaunee, and most recently the territory of the Mississaugas of the Credit. We also recognize that the participants on today's webinar are located in other traditional lands across Ontario. Today, this meeting place is still the home to many First Nations, Inuit, and Métis peoples from across Turtle Island, and we are grateful to have the opportunity to work on this territory. By personally making a land acknowledgement, you are taking part in the act of reconciliation, honoring the land and Indigenous heritage, which dates back over 10,000 years. Hi, I'm Cindy, and on behalf of your hosts, RNAO, Community Health Nurses Initiatives Group, and Community Health Nurses of Canada, I want to welcome you to today's webinar. This webinar is one of the many resources made available by the Ontario Ministry of Health and Long-Term Care. I am very happy to introduce our speakers for today's panel, whose full bios will be shared after the webinar. So we have Matthew McCugan, who graduated with the Bachelor of Health Science at the University of Western Ontario, and he has a BSCN through St. Clair College, University of Windsor's collaborative program. While studying in Windsor, Matthew completed a community placement with Windsor Essex Health Unit in tobacco cessation. This was Matthew's first exposure to public health and immediately sparked an interest in how public health works to shape communities. He began working with Chatham-Kent in May of 2019 as their tobacco cessation nurse and developed an interest in the emergence of e-cigarettes. Matthew continues to work in this role and has expanded his portfolio to include naloxone expansion program and a whole lot more COVID-19 than he was hoping for. And next, I'd like to introduce Rob Schwartz, who I've had the great pleasure of working with on many projects over the years. He's the Executive Director of the Ontario Tobacco Research Unit, Professor at the Institute of Health Policy, Management and Evaluation in the Dalai Lama School of Public Health at U of T, and Senior Scientist. He's for Center for Addiction and Mental Health. Dr. Schwartz is Director of the U of T Collaborative Specialization in Public Health Policy. At OTRU, Rob directs research, evaluation, knowledge exchange, and capacity building programs. His research interests are broad. They include tobacco control policy, e-cigarettes, strategy design and evaluation of tobacco control programs and policies, public health policy, accountability, the politics and quality of evaluation, performance measurements, and performance auditing. He's published widely about tobacco control, accountability, public health policy, policy change, evaluation, and government third sector relations. So needless to say, he has a lot of experience in tobacco control. So I will turn it over to our speakers.
All right, thank you very much for the introduction, Cindy. As mentioned, my name is Matthew. I'm a registered nurse with Chatham-Kent Public Health on our chronic disease and well-being team. As I said, I'm a registered nurse. I'm not an expert in physiology or the pharmaceutical effects of nicotine. What I hope to present today in as objective manner as possible, while also talking about my subjective experiences working with clients who are looking to alter their e-cigarette use. Oh, there we go. So my objectives today for my portion of the presentation is to briefly touch on the role of language, as well as touch on what an e-cigarette is, what current rates are, current trends in Ontario are, and what we have been working on in Chatham-Kent, as well as what other health units can do to, or organizations can do to change their policies. So I'd like to touch on language a little bit first and foremost. With e-cigarettes, there seems to be a lot of terminology being thrown around, especially when you begin looking at the literature. I've seen multiple different terms used to describe e-cigarettes. The World Health Organization's preferred term is electronic nicotine delivery systems. For simplicity's sake, in this presentation, I'm going to be using the term e-cigarettes or electronic cigarettes. As just kind of trying to change the terminology around as well, change the way that we view the term vaping or vapes, and just kind of take it into a more professional lens, a more clinical lens. As I pointed out in the slide, vaping is an industry term, and it is often used to mislead people who use these cigarettes into believing that it is just a water vapor product they are inhaling, when it is a chemical aerosol. And I also want to work towards changing how we view nicotine dependence. When you look at a lot of definitions around nicotine use disorder, nicotine dependence, they're not reflective of current trends we are seeing. They're very much dependent on combustible tobacco and the role of combustible tobacco in the addictive process. I also would like to briefly mention the power of branding when it comes to e-cigarette companies, especially with the introduction of Juul into the Canadian market in 2018, and how it was branded as marketed as a lifestyle brand, as well as the different various flavors that have been used to further market their product as a status brand. So just a little collage I threw together to just kind of depict some of the marketing tactics. In the top left-hand corner is just a photo that I threw in there as a joke, back to my University of Western days. But in the bottom left corner is a kind of urban jungle that Vype put downtown Toronto to kind of lure people into trying their products. The top right corner is some marketing that Juul has used, and in the bottom right hand corner is just some of the various flavors that have been found on the e-cigarette market, or that kind of may appeal to a younger audience. So the evolution of electronic cigarettes over time began first in around 2007 with the introduction of Cig-a-lights, which were a disposable form of e-cigarette. It's evolved dramatically since through vape pens of the box mod style, into the introduction of Juul. On this slide it says 2015, but it was introduced into the Canadian market in 2018, and the emergence of disposable Juul-like products, or a variety of similar Juul-like brands in the subsequent years. So an e-cigarette tends to be made up of four parts: the mouthpiece, a heating element, and a battery, and the nicotine solution, which can either be a free-based solution or the kind of industry standard, which is a nicotine salt-based solution, which you can either have a pre-filled device or a refillable device. And based on the type of device, it could be pod, or it could be actual filling in a cartridge, or a tank, sorry. So with the free-base nicotine, the efficacy of delivery it's not as stable as nicotine salt. It was a little bit more irritable in the throat. It didn't deliver nicotine in as strong of as much potency as the nicotine salts. It was a little bit basic pH or more basic pH. Whereas with nicotine salts, they added a carbon or a hydrocarbon tail, and they were able to create a more stable product that delivered higher amounts of nicotine in a smaller dose. This is just a slide that I borrowed from Dr. Hammond from the University of Waterloo. He borrowed it from British American Tobacco. What it does is it kind of compares the delivery of nicotine from their products to combustible tobacco. And as you can see, with these two top lines here in the chart, that the nicotine salts are delivering almost as much nicotine as combustible tobacco can deliver during use. And this is just another slide I kind of repurposed from Dr. Andrew Pipe from University of Ottawa. And it's the probability of dependence after trying a substance at least once, with tobacco and nicotine at the very top of the list at 32%. Meanwhile, in Canada, while e-cigarettes have been often marketed as an alternative option for people who are using combustible tobacco, quite often what we are seeing is that the majority of people who are picking them up are younger adults or adolescents and young adults, as opposed to an older population who are more likely to be using combustible tobacco. This is a slide that kind of presents the trends across Canada through the 2019 tobacco and nicotine survey through Stats Canada. In regards to Ontario, what we see with this chart is in 2013-2014, about 28% of Ontario youth and adolescents had tried an e-cigarette at some point in time, whereas by 2018-2019, that had jumped to 44.2%. And current use rates jumped from 7% in 2013-14 to 25.7% in 2018-2019. So I do not want to go into too much detail around youth and adolescents use, as that will be covered in a presentation later on. However, it is the most concerning trend that we have been seeing with in the realm of e-cigarettes, as it opens the floodgate for a whole new generation of nicotine users, and there's a significant amount of misinformation being tossed around about the efficacy and safety of the product. Youth and adolescents tend to view it as a safer product, and okay, thank you for the notice, Rob. So that kind of threw me off a little bit. So I'm not going to touch on this very much for the moment, but it has been shown to increase the potential use of combustible tobacco if ever trying an e-cigarette. So in regards to my role in public health as working in our cessation program, quite often I've worked with quite a few clients who have attempted to use e-cigarettes as a cessation aid, the vast majority of which have been unsuccessful with their attempt. When you look at the literature, it's very hit and miss about if e-cigarettes are actually an effective a cessation aid. There's still a lot of more work that needs to be done. However, at this moment, there is not enough evidence to support the claim. The other thing that I really want to take note of is the misinformation around the potential health complications. So based off of current literature, e-cigarettes are likely to provide a safer alternative for people who are currently smoking tobacco products and may not be ready or want to quit at this time. However, it is very important to note that at this moment, we cannot say with absolute certainty how much safer they are. with that being said, if I have clients that I'm working with who want to use an electronic cigarette to help support them in transitioning over, I am supportive of them. I do advise them that it is at their own discretion that they continue to use an electronic cigarette. For me, I really want to place an emphasis on cessation. Another thing that's kind of noticed that's not really looked at in the studies is whether a client is transitioning over from combustible tobacco to an electronic cigarette and continuing to use the electronic cigarette as opposed to complete abstinence from nicotine. My position what I hope to do with my clients is not transition them from one delivery mechanism to another, but instead to support them in quitting using nicotine altogether. Just a quick little overview of some of the current known health risks associated with electronic cigarette use. We do know that it can result in acute impairment of arterial dilation. It has the potential to increase risk for atherosclerosis, increased risk for cardiovascular disease, as well as increasing risk for lung disease, including acute lung disease and chronic lung disease. And there's also, as I mentioned earlier, that increased risk for future combustible cigarette use. As many of you probably remember, electronic cigarettes and their potential health risks were really brought to the forefront of the news last year during the electronic cigarette or vaping product use associated lung injury epidemic or valley. So I'm sure a lot of people, that was really their first exposure to electronic cigarettes. I know when I first came into this role, that's what was really beginning to take off and what really sparked my interest in e-cigarettes and their potential risks, and especially towards youth and adolescents and young adults. So with EVALI, what it's been mostly contributed to is counterfeit THC solutions that contained vitamin E acetate that was used as a thickening agent. This was found in the majority of samples that were collected. However, it was not found in all the samples, which still kind of raises concern for any potential other acute lung injuries that could be associated with electronic cigarettes. So this is just a quick chart to show, this is from 2013, so it may be a little dated, but it just compares some of the toxicants that are found between electronic cigarettes and conventional cigarettes. They're found in significantly lower numbers in electronic cigarettes, but at this time, no one can really say for certain how little is safe. Or how little is harmless. It's very up in the air, and we need to continue to monitor for potential long-term chronic effects of continued electronic nicotine device use. So this is kind of the role. This is where I'm really going to talk about what we've been working on in Chatham-Kent. Both myself as a nurse, our tobacco enforcement officer, and our youth educator. This is where I feel most comfortable talking about, because this is where I've kind of played the largest part in. So when I came to the organization, I came in at a time where we were looking at updating our brief contact intervention policy around tobacco products. And like I said, it kind of ironically coincided with the EVALI situation. And so I wanted to begin not just asking people about their tobacco use, but about all nicotine use, such as snuff, cigars, chewing tobacco, electronic cigarettes, etc. In that way, because at the end of the day, nicotine use disorder is nicotine addiction is nicotine addiction, and everyone should be treated the same and not left or not disregarded based off of their use. Now, in regards to some of the other options, it's a little bit more difficult to gauge how much nicotine people are receiving on a daily basis. So that I'm not going to talk about that in a moment with our medical directive, But with our brief contact intervention policy, we want all our staff to ask clients at every interaction about their nicotine use behaviors, how much nicotine they use, and then also refer them to the appropriate sources. With our BCI policy, we are also going a little bit further with it, and we're hoping to kind of create a framework with community partners to refer clients to mental health services, especially youth and adolescents. And a lot of the clients, to be honest, that I've worked with have had adverse mental health that were actually acted as a factor that continued their nicotine use, whether it be anxiety, depression, and just kind of using it as a coping mechanism, as a form of self-medication. And this is something that we've really noticed amongst our adolescent population. And something that we're really kind of hoping to begin exploring is providing earlier mental health interventions through this process, through our brief contact intervention policy, to help prevent any future nicotine or substance use or any adverse mental health issues. So with our medical directive, I noticed that there was a little bit of a gap, that no one was really offering support for people who are using electronic cigarettes to help them quit. And there's also very little literature on using conventional methods such as NRT to help clients quit. I could only find one article that helped, where someone was able to use nicotine patches and gum to transition off of electronic cigarettes to abstinence, to a nicotine abstinence. So one of the first steps I took was redefining in our medical directive how we approached nicotine dependence, viewing it not just as a tobacco-related dependence, as the current definitions tend to point out, but instead an addiction to the drug nicotine that involves the physical and psychological factors that make it difficult to quit. Now, when in our medical directive, when working with a client, we ask staff to assess for the device they use, the solution that you're using, whether it's nicotine salt or free-base nicotine, frequency of use. And then we've also developed an equation, and I recognize that the equation has a lot of flaws to it. It really only works to gauge an approximation, and we do need to kind of still guess, but if we can figure out how much nicotine a client is using per day, we can then hope to adjust the NRT accordingly. I'd like to personally start my clients off with the lower patch if they do want to do the patch route, and then titrate up as need. But I also understand that each case is unique and needs to be managed as such. That everyone who uses nicotine has their own unique relationship to the drug, and everyone uses it for different reasons, whether it's for just out of routine, for mental health, anxiety, depression purposes, what we're seeing in our youth and adolescents, or if it's become just such a part of their life and they're just addicted to the nicotine, they want to reduce their nicotine use. So another thing that we've done in Chatham-Kent is, and this is, we don't have much of a budget in regards to different programs we can implement. So a lot of what we've done is just changing resources that we have to meet the demands for electronic cigarettes. So we've taken the 4A vaping or 4A approach, and we've adjusted it for electronic cigarette interventions. So asking, especially, and we've mostly been using this for youth and adolescents, asking them about their use, advising them to quit, assisting them, and then arranging services. So some of this, in regards to adolescents, some of the services we've been doing is meeting them at the high school, providing group counseling sessions or one-on-one sessions, depending on what their desires are. We've actually, another thing about our medical directive is we've lowered the age to 14 years of age for the provision of nicotine replacement therapy. So what we've been kind of doing with youth is using a lot more of the quick acting NRT, such as the gum and the lozenges, as opposed to patches. We find that our younger clients are more interested in kind of that quick, and also that there's probably some stigma and some fear of stigma around having a patch on that keeps them from wanting to use the the patches, but also looking at their frequency, their use. And with COVID, we've noticed that we've actually had a really large spike in adolescents and high school students reaching out to us for support as they're not able to leave school property. We've also seen increased rates of youth either using e-cigarettes or smoking in school bathrooms. That has increased our demand, or the increased schools reaching out to us for support. So this is just some information, some statistics from Chatham-Kent from last year. We had Smoke Free Ontario Act violations for children as young as 10 years old. And we had 44 tickets issued during a 6-month period, which was more than the previous decade worth of tobacco work combined for our tobacco enforcement officer. So that's just kind of a little bit of the context in Chatham-Kent. Our youth electronic cigarette use rates are fairly high, with 32% reporting current e-cigarette use, and an additional 17% reporting using an e-cigarette at least once over the past year. And if you look at our grade 12, 60% of our grade 12 class from last year have reported using an electronic cigarette, whereas 40% of that's reported current daily use. So I just want to also briefly touch on my personal clinical experience with working with clients using electronic cigarettes. I want to say about 25% of the clients that I've worked with over the past year had attempted to use an electronic cigarette to either help them quit their tobacco use. And I only had 2 clients of that 25% who were successful with transitioning from combustible tobacco to electronic cigarettes. And at that point is when they reached out to me because they wanted support with stopping their electronic cigarette use. And that's where we used nicotine replacement therapy, cognitive behavioral therapy, to kind of help alter the behaviors as well as reduce their dependence on nicotine. I also worked with 4 students at the high school. Our youth educator normally works with high school students, but these particular cases, they came to me. And out of the 4, only 1 was no longer using electronic cigarettes by the end of the 6-month period of our interactions. The majority continued to use electronic cigarettes. And that's where I really began to take note of the mental health aspect of their use. When I would ask them why they continued to use or what situations they'd be more likely to use. And it was always feelings of anxiety, depression, high stress situations, crowded situations, if they felt anxious in crowds. And the client that was successful, he essentially he was in a not directly in one of our high schools, but in a program outside of our high schools where he kind of didn't have that same interaction with his peers. And so once he was kind of out of that crowded anxiety or anxious, or that crowded setting where that might trigger his anxiety, it really helped him to reduce his nicotine use. So in regards to political advocacy, that's something that we do try to work on quite a bit in Chatham-Kent. Prior to the Ontario legislation around electronic cigarette marketing, we were actually working on, and we were about to present to council to vote on a bylaw that would ban outdoor electronic cigarette marketing. What we know, the majority of our high schools in Chatham-Kent have an electronic cigarette retailer within 100 meters of the building. And one thing we noticed when we did a quick little community scan was that those retailers, which were normally corner stores and convenience stores or gas stations, had higher rates of advertising than those that were not close to a high school or a school of any means. So we wanted to kind of work towards banning that. The literature is very clear that exposure to advertising increases potential risk for electronic cigarette use. Right now we are also currently working on adjusting our retailer licensing fee. Right now it's pretty low, so we'd like to increase it to it acts as more of a deterrent for businesses that are looking to sell electronic nicotine products or electronic cigarette products. And so I also want to just quickly note on the ability of registered nurses to advocate for policy change within your own community. That policy change doesn't have to be brought through a public health unit. It could be a nurse bringing up a concern within their organization, looking at changing the policies on your unit or within your organization around addressing electronic cigarette use, providing clients who are using electronic cigarettes with NRT if they're an inpatient, in order to help mitigating withdrawals, as well as advocating to your municipal councilors, your MPPs, your MPs around just different policies you'd like to see in your community, changes you'd like to see within your community around electronic cigarettes or anything that you feel passionate about. And so with that being said, I'm going to transition to someone who's significantly more well-versed in the matter, Dr. Schwartz.
Thank you, Matthew. That was a great introduction. And I'm really pleased to be following you because I follow in your footsteps. Actually, as always in public health, it's at the local level that leads, and learning what's going on in Chatham-Kent and probably applies to many other health units is tremendously important. I've been tasked with doing something a little bit different. And that is to.
Oh, you're just on mute, Rob.
Sorry about that. Okay, and here we go. So this is what I've been tasked with, basically understanding what can we do about the problem that we have with e-cigarettes. I'm going to define the problem a little bit. Matthew has done it. I'm going to be a little more concise. I'm also going to go a little faster. So if you have questions, if I miss things, if you want clarifications, Tanya, I think they can post in the chat. Yes?
Yes.
Okay, wonderful. Okay. Yes, I'm pressing very hard. There we go. So Matthew spoke about the prevalence of e-cigarette use. I wanted to highlight this slide because the exponential growth is really quite incredible. We are now in 2018-19, according to CS TABS, students in grades 10 to 12. We have 29% of them, okay, using in the past 30 days. But importantly, of those, 40% report that they are using daily. The daily use of e-cigarettes, of nicotine, and they almost all use nicotine, it suggests that they have become dependent on e-cigarettes. Matthew did a great job in outlining some of the health risks of e-cigarettes. What he didn't mention in that slide is dependence in of itself, although that was on a different slide. Dependence is a problem that we need to worry about. Thank you, whoever advanced the slide. You can leave it there for a sec. And therefore, our focus in regulating e-cigarettes is to try to decrease their access for youth, so that youth do not actually become dependent on e-cigarettes. Matthew correctly pointed out that there is lots of evidence now. I was skeptical at first, but now there is lots of evidence demonstrating that e-cigarette use is actually a gateway to combustible cigarette use. It's been proven in many, many studies, including research that we have done on our own. So I'm going to start now with the regulations. The first type of regulation you can have is regulating sales. And indeed, there are many countries listed in this first row that outright ban e-cigarette sales. You just cannot sell them. And well, you know, the train has left the station on that possibility in Canada for sure. There are still some countries in the bottom row that ban all nicotine-containing e-cigarettes. It was as recently as May 2018 that nicotine e-cigarettes were actually prohibited for sale in Canada, although they were still widely sold. But some countries, some important countries, still do ban nicotine e-cigarettes, and you can see them listed in the last row. Other countries in the middle here have all kinds of other specific regulations about the sale of e-cigarettes. Well, in Canada, in Ontario, we are not going to ban e-cigarettes. I don't think we are going to ban nicotine e-cigarettes. So what else can we do if we want to keep these things out of the hands of youngsters? Clearly, the youth access rules that we have in place, which means that you can't sell to minors, are not working if 29% of grades 10 to 12 are using in the past 30 days. So we're going to try and move to the next slide now. And there we go. So another thing we can do is actually not ban nicotine altogether, but we can have regulations on the use of nicotine concentrations and on type of nicotine. So many countries, and now including many jurisdictions, now including at least 2 Canadian jurisdictions, and Ontario to an extent, have moved to regulating nicotine concentrations. In Ontario, you can only sell nicotine concentrations of greater than 20 milligrams per milliliter in adult-only stores, i.e. in vape shops. You can't sell that any longer in convenience stores. 2 other provinces, British Columbia and it's either Nova Scotia or PEI, have now banned, I've got it in a different slide, have now banned the sale of nicotine concentrations of greater than 20 milligrams per milliliter. This has been in place in the European Union for several years now, and many other countries have taken it up. I would love to advance to the next slide. Thank you. So yeah, just keep going to the next one. Thank you very much. So here we have what can we do about regulating e-cigarette products, the actual e-cigarettes themselves, or the things that we put in e-cigarettes. So we talked about sales regulations. We talked about banning nicotine e-cigarettes. We talked about limiting nicotine concentrations. Other things we can do is actually limit the size of the cartridges or the refills, which is in place in the European Union, or we could prohibit nicotine salts. France and Iceland actually prohibit protonated nicotine, i.e. nicotine salts, or any other kind of additive that facilitates inhalation. If it weren't for nicotine salts, we would not have 55 milligram per milliliter as we have in Juul and Vuse and other e-cigarettes. It would mean that we could, at the highest levels that you would likely be able to tolerate high levels of nicotine would be maybe 18 milligrams per milliliter, but quite likely for most people, lower than that. A third group of things that we could do is we could regulate e-cigarette mechanisms, the actual e-cigarette devices themselves. So it's not enough to actually limit the nicotine concentrations. If we really want to have an effect on how much nicotine a person is absorbing into their respiratory system and into then going up to the brain, we need to limit the heat or the wattage, the power as well, because that's an important element of how much nicotine actually gets inhaled and absorbed in the body, and also the length of the puff. So we could actually devise e-cigarettes so that they automatically shut off. after X numbers of seconds. And that would have a, we limited, that's good, leave it there. If we limited the nicotine power, the device power, we prohibited nicotine salts, we prohibited, we regulated the level of concentration, and we had devices that stopped after X number of seconds, then we might be able actually to have devices on the market and e-cigarette concentrations on the market that would decrease their appeal, especially to young people. Of all of these things that are possibilities listed in the previous two slides, the only thing that has happened so far in Canada is that we have, yeah, it's okay, we can, okay, Catherine, all right, let's just keep it here for a minute. The only thing that has happened in Canada so far is actually regulating nicotine concentrations. And here you see British Columbia, Ontario, and Nova Scotia. Federally, 66 milligrams per milliliter is actually a level of nicotine concentration that can be fatal. So we're not going to worry about that. Thank you. What else can we do? Well, we could regulate flavors. Because we know from our work in cigarettes and in other areas that flavors are what attract especially young people to using e-cigarettes. If it weren't for flavors, research suggests that youth wouldn't use them at all. So if it was only tobacco flavor, it's very unlikely that a non-cigarette using young person would have any interest at all in using an e-cigarette. This is demonstrated. You've got several sources here of our results here. By the way, we have reports up on the Ontario Tobacco Research Unit website that gives details and where we have the evidence for all of these things. And moving to the next slide. So we can ban flavors altogether. We can ban just all flavors except menthol and mint. We can do all kinds of things. And we're going to move now to the next slide as well, because I'm trying to move forward. So in the EU, there is actually no ban on flavors that can be used. Moving forward, New Zealand also unclear on the impacts of flavor bans on moving to different devices. In the United States, there are some efforts being made now to move away from fruit and minty flavors. You can't sell them. You can't. There's an enforcement guideline, not a rule, not a law at this point. But you can't sell them in certain formations. But we don't have any evidence yet about what the results are. I want to get to Canada, so we'll move forward. So we have lots of evidence in Canada about the use of fruits and candy flavor and mint and menthol flavor. That is what is being used by youth. But it's also important to note, yeah, we can leave it here. It's also important to note that adults who are trying to quit smoking combustible cigarettes by vaping e-cigarettes, they also like flavors. So we cannot deny this, we have to respect it. So if e-cigarettes are going to become ever an effective cessation device, we do probably need to allow smokers access to flavors. Okay. One of the policy options here, which is in effect in some places, is to ban all flavors except mint and menthol. So in Ontario, for example, now, you can sell mint and menthol in convenience stores, but all the other flavors you can buy only in adult-only vape shops. The problem with that kind of rule is that there's lots of evidence to suggest that the youth who now may be vaping fruit or candy will move to mint and menthol. They like mint and menthol. They may not like it as much as some of the other flavors, but plenty of them like it. And there's lots of evidence showing that they do move to mint and menthol when the other flavors are not available. So this isn't likely to be a very effective measure. And there will be likely enforcement challenges with this. An illicit market, we know that social sources is huge. We know that lots of people get it through the internet, even if it's illegal, it still is happening. Move to the next slide, please. Yeah, so what if we, as in Ontario, we restrict flavors to adult-only stores? Once again, what I haven't said so far is that there's data from Health Canada and from other sources demonstrating that lots of vape shops are failing the test shops, and they are selling to youth. And so this may not work to keep this out of the hands of young people. Moreover, we know that if we ban flavored e-cigarettes, if we don't make flavored e-cigarettes available in convenience stores, and we continue to make combustible cigarettes available in convenience stores, we're actually making the more harmful substance more available to smokers. So smokers who may be interested in quitting smoking and vaping instead may have a harder time. We know that ease of access can be quite challenging. The rate of social supply of e-cigarettes to youth is very high based on our surveys. I don't have it in my hands right now, but you can rest assured that a good chunk of those underage people who are vaping e-cigarettes are getting them from social sources. Okay, we're going to move to the next slide now, please. So we've talked about nicotine concentrations and product regulation. We've talked about flavor regulation. The final area I want to mention is marketing regulations. So there's no question, marketing is very effective, although we don't have any direct research on the effectiveness of banning e-cigarette marketing. This is where youth, according to public opinion research done by Health Canada, this is where youth have seen or heard advertising or promotion. This is true of 2019. And so you can see that lots of people are seeing or hearing lots of marketing and promotions of e-cigarettes in lots of different ways. Please pay attention that social media is the strongest, okay? 40% and more of youth and young adults are exposed to advertising of e-cigarettes on social media. Cutting that off is going to be extremely difficult. Next slide, please. So what can we do? Well, we can ban ads on websites and mobile apps, or on billboards within 1,000 feet of schools and playgrounds, as has been done in California. In New Jersey has banned ads on transit. The European Union doesn't allow promotional elements on packaging. In Ireland, websites can't promote e-cigarettes, etc. So these are all what fall into what I call partial bans, and some of these are very partial bans. Next slide, please. Here are some additional things that can be done. You can restrict so they're not so that ads are not appealing to youth. This is the federal rule right now. It has been all along. If you've seen ads that are appealing to youth, the difficulty with this, the way the federal legislation is written, and it's not just for e-cigarettes, it's true in other areas also, is that the courts have ruled that it has to be, in order for it to be prohibited, it has to be uniquely appealing to youth. That means if it's appealing to me and to young people, it's still allowed. But there actually isn't that much kind of marketing and advertising that is uniquely appealing to youth. So effectively, this legislation, the way that it's written, can we go back please for a moment? The way that it's written now is not very effective at all. Industry self-regulation has failed over and over in other areas. Restrict to adult venues and channels. Yeah, if we could do that, that would be helpful. The partial marketing bans, or we could actually have a total marketing ban. So we don't have a complete total marketing ban even for combustible cigarettes, but we're close. With the advent of plain packaging, we're closer. There still are some holes in that. If we could do the same for e-cigarettes, then that is the only thing, because research shows over and over again that when you only have partial marketing bans, the marketing resources that the industry has are put into other places, and they get the message out clearly. Next slide, please. Yeah, we can go to the next one. I spoke to this. Again, we spoke to this, so we can move on. And I can summarize, and I think I did this in record time. But what I hope I have laid out in front of you, that there are lots of policy options about marketing, about flavors, about nicotine content and other product regulations that could be considered. There is lots that the government could do. Some of these could be done at the local level, some of the provincial level, some at the federal level. And today we are only doing some of them. And the ones that we are doing tend to be partial, as with flavors or nicotine concentrations and or marketing. And so I'll leave it there, and I'll hand it over to Tanya or Cindy, whoever's moderating. Thank you.
Thank you, Rob, and thank you, Matthew. We have some time for questions and answers. So if you have any questions, feel free to write them in the chat box. We have one so far, so I can say what question we've received. It reads, I see conflicting research on the effectiveness of vaping as a means of reducing health harms for adults looking to stop smoking in harm reduction circles. In Canada, we need to all be on the same page with this. So I guess that was just more of a comment. Did you want to?
I can start and then hand it over. What has happened with e-cigarette research is that it has become somewhat ideological, and some researchers dig in their feet. On one end of the continuum, they're completely pushing for e-cigarettes as harm reduction for smokers. And on the other end of the continuum, there are people who don't want to have anything to do with e-cigarettes. They think they shouldn't be used even by smokers. The research on the relative harms of e-cigarettes to cigarettes indicates that e-cigarettes are less harmful. How much less harmful is where the big question comes in. Almost everybody will agree that if you're not a smoker, you shouldn't be using e-cigarettes, because you have to look at the absolute risk, not at the relative risk in that situation. I also think that almost everybody will agree that using nothing, but if smokers can quit everything and not use cigarettes or e-cigarettes, they will be better off. And most researchers will also agree, based on the evidence, that if a smoker isn't able to totally quit and not use anything, they will be better off using e-cigarettes than they would be smoking combustible cigarettes. There's fairly broad consensus on this, and maybe we just need more messaging.
Great, thank you. And then another question, does the European Union limit flavors?
I don't believe so.
No.
Sorry, Matthew, feel free to,
No, I know nothing. I don't know anything about the European Union and if they ban flavors at all.
Okay. And then what are the studies saying on secondhand smoke from e-cigarettes?
So secondhand aerosol, so I just use different terminology from e-cigarettes. We don't have conclusive evidence about it. We know that there are things in it that are not good. There's nicotine in it, for example, which is certainly not good for pregnant women or for young people or people compromised in other ways. At the same time, the most recent studies that I've seen have not found significant challenges from e-cigarette aerosols secondhand.
Okay, great. Thank you, Rob. And then another question, do you think the increase of e-cigarette use in the past few years in Canada has any relation to the legalization of marijuana?
Matthew, you want to go for that one?
So I can't really comment on this. I know cannabis-based or THC-based products are just, or legal THC-based products are just beginning to kind of come into the market. I know cannabis use, I believe cannabis use rates have declined slightly among youth and adolescents. So I'm just going to quickly pull up. I have the numbers right here. So I don't think there's much of a correlation between the two. But it's still kind of too early to say, like I said, especially with electronic delivery THC products just kind of becoming available on the broader market.
Yeah, I'll just chime in on that as well. We don't know for sure. The advent, cannabis became legalized at about the same time as nicotine e-cigarettes became legalized, and we were subject to the huge marketing and distribution of the tobacco company-owned e-cigarette brands. We don't know what the crossover is between vaping e-cigarettes, nicotine e-cigarettes, and vaping cannabis. But we're hearing more and more about people doing both. Some people using the same device to do both. We're doing research now, looking at both vaping of cannabis and vaping of the e-cigarettes. So stay tuned.
Excellent, thanks. And so we have one more question and just a comment. So I'll read the question. Can you summarize what the current regulations use in Ontario right now? Again, if you don't mind just re-summarizing that.
I can try. Matthew, maybe you're because you're in the field, you're more up to, or Cindy. I know, but I think I may get something wrong. Cindy, are you feeling really good about this one? We can't hear you.
You're still, sounds like you're muted, Cindy. Did you turn your volume off maybe? Nope, still can't hear you.
Okay, so I'll try to answer it. So in Ontario today, the Ontario government made a couple of changes, basically moving, as I said, high concentrations of nicotine, above 20 milligrams per milliliter, can only be sold now in vape shops because they're adults only. Similarly, all flavors except, I believe, mint and menthol can only be sold in the convenience stores, in the vape shops, sorry. Ontario has now also banned any marketing in convenience stores, different than what we saw before. What else in Ontario? Those are some of the major ones.
Yeah, if you had asked me this question 6-7 months ago, I would have been able to answer it on a dime, but COVID is kind of throwing everything for a little bit of a trip.
Cindy, did you want to chime in? Can you? No, we still can't hear you. I'm not sure. I know you're not muted.
Yeah, maybe in the meantime, I'll address another question here about e-cigarettes without nicotine. So we're doing the research now, but it's not the nicotine in of itself that is harmful to the respiratory system. It's the aerosol and the small particulate matter. Also, sometimes it's flavoring agents. And sometimes it has to do with the carrying agent being vegetable glycerin or propylene glycol. We don't know everything about this. The nicotine is what's addictive in e-cigarettes.
Great, and then we just had a comment about messaging. Clearer messaging for youth and adults need to be crystal clear. And then there was one other question, or anecdotally, we are seeing more acute health issues in adolescents due to vaping, whereas consumptibles seem to have historically created chronic issues. Is this being considered in the harm reduction approach?
I'm not exactly clear on the question. We see more acute health. Oh, well, Peter, I mean, it's, the fact that, youth are presenting with acute health issues is alarming, first of all. If they continue to vape, the fear is that they are dependent. So that's already a health issue. And also the respiratory effects, the cardiovascular effects, the potential toxicity over time may lead to them having chronic health problems. And so what I would say to an adolescent who's vaping is that, yeah, we're worried about your acute symptoms. We can help you with those. But you've got to think forward also, which I know is a really hard thing to tell an adolescent. Yeah, so I'm not sure, Peter, if I answered your question, so feel free to say where I think we're out of time, actually.
Yeah, great. Thank you so much. I think time is up. Thank you for all participants in today's webinar, and thank you again to Matthew and Rob for your fantastic presentations, for Cindy for introductions and moderating today's session. Within the next day or so, all participants will receive an email with the link to the evaluation for today's webinar. Please fill out the survey. That'll help us in evaluating the webinar, as well as planning for future upcoming webinars. Upon completion of the evaluation, a link will be provided and you can access the certificate of completion. And note that the evaluation will be closed within 2 weeks. And I hope you enjoyed today's webinar. And for more information about our program and events, please visit Arneo. And thank you once again.